Recording in progress.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Lindsay Compton. I'm the Education and Public Programs Manager for the Society of Illustrators. Thank you all for being here for tonight's panel discussion, Spider-Man at 60, Celebrating an Icon. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat because they often get lost in the chat. Please use the Q&A and there will be some time at the end to answer a few. To start things off, it's my pleasure to introduce Danny Fingeroth, who will be leading the conversation this evening. Danny Fingeroth was the group editor of Marvel's Spider-Man comics line and writer of the Deadly Foes of Spider-Man limited series. He has had the honor of working with Spidey co-creators Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, and with iconic Spider artist John Romita Sr. Danny is a popular culture critic and historian whose books include 2019's A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. So Danny, if you'd like to start.
Oh boy, thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Society of Illustrators, Anel, Lindsay, everybody at that wonderful organization. Thanks so much for hosting this. I'm going to introduce these people because although they need no introduction, they're getting ones anyway. So I will start with Tom DeFalco, a former editor-in-chief at Marvel Comics with over 70 books currently in print.
It's a lot of books.
Tom DeFalco joined, but you have to print them all by hand. Tom DeFalco joined the comic book industry in 1972 and has written comics starring Spider-Man, Spider-Girl, Fantastic Four, Thor, Superman, the Flintstones, and Archie. He has also produced Spider-Man, The Ultimate Guide, and Comic Creators on Spider-Man. Brian Michael Bendis is one of the most successful writers working in mainstream comics at Marvel Entertainment. Brian's many achievements included 18 years as writer on Spider-Man and the introduction of the multiracial Spider-Man, Miles Morales. Recently, Bendis has brought his creator-owned Jinx World imprint over to Dark Horse Comics, where his publications include his classic Powers with Michael A. Van Oving and Joy Operations with Stephen Byrne. Welcome. John Semper has written and produced popular animated cartoons for 40 years. So these are all the new guys. In the 90s, he was personally hired by Stan Lee to be the producer and head writer for Spider-Man, the animated series. His most recent project, an animated feature titled Green Lantern, Beware My Power, which he co-wrote with Ernie Altbacker, will be released by DC Warner Brothers on July 26th. Mark S. Ditko isn't a comic book writer or artist, but runs his own global civil engineering consulting business from Los Angeles, California. His comic industry claim to fame is only, and that's only in Mark's own word, I don't think it's only, by association, as Steve Ditko's nephew. Growing up with his uncle as a family member, they began writing each other around 1990 at a family, industry, and philosophical level. Mark is committed to preserving and spreading the works and beliefs of a very remarkable comic book artist, character creator, and family member. Welcome, Mark. And last, but needless to say, by no means least, Maggie Thompson says she's a, quote, celebrity adjacent award-winning pop culture nerd, unquote. She and her late husband, Don, were among the fans who enjoyed comics so much more than 60 years ago that they wrote about it. After 3 decades of co-editing Comics Buyer's Guide, Maggie contributes to San Diego's Comic-Con International and Gemstone Publishing, celebrating what's old and new. Hey, everybody. Okay, just bear with me one more minute while I read this fancy introduction. Spider-Man was created, if you're here, you know all this stuff, but let me just run through this. If you're coming to a Spider-Man panel, and you don't know about Spider-Man, that's what you have Wikipedia. Spider-Man was created 60 years ago. He first appeared in Amazing Fantasy 15, which appeared actually this week in 1962. 6 months later, he had his own comic. He was co-created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And he quickly became one of the most recognizable superheroes, still is. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Spider-Man. Others come and go, but the only ones that have kept going for 60, 70, 80 years have been those guys. Of course, Spider-Man, besides being a character people love, is also a multi-billion-dollar intellectual property. Hence, there's some conflict and controversy at times about who did what and who gets what and who got what and who's recognized. So that might come up tonight. There are no holds barred, but I'm hoping we can celebrate the creators and the character. Oh, Citibank is calling me.
I get that.
They know you're home.
You better pay that mortgage.
They heard me mention money, you know. So that's it. So I've got. So I'm going to deftly and smoothly segue into a PowerPoint, because those things always work perfectly, where I will ask everybody, just, again, if you're here, you know this stuff, and I'm just going to do a trip through Spider-Man history, leaving out, no doubt, your favorite thing, but emphasizing work done by people who are on the panel, or by relatives of people on the panel. My relatives didn't have that much to do with Spider-Man, but and then we'll it'll be a panel. We'll talk, we'll take questions, we'll have fun. All right, I'm gonna do. Don't look at all these images. Okay. Share. Okay. View slideshow. Yeah, here we go. That everybody can see this. Oh, and by the way, Brian will have to leave at about the hour mark, and so I thank him in advance for being here in the first place. But I may lean some of the earlier stuff towards Brian. Anywho, Amazing Fantasy 15, drawn by Jack Kirby and inked by Steve Ditko. The world may mock Peter Parker; it will soon marvel at Spider-Man, and there's an important message for you. So, but this is one of the most iconic comics in comics history. The character was created by this gentleman. This is Stan Lee, before he had a toupee or hair implants. He had his Frank Sinatra hat. And by this gentleman, by Steve Ditko, who is Mark's uncle. And just before the panel, Mark sent me this. Mark, what's this shot?
So this is just one time that we were together. I'm the smaller one, and my older brother is 2 years older than me, is the taller one. And of course, that's my uncle in the middle. And it was taken right around probably 63. I was probably about 4 years old, somewhere around there. My brother was probably around 6 or so. And that was my uncle. That's how I knew him. That's how I grew up with him, just goofing around.
And that's the house you grew up in?
That's the house that he grew up in.
He grew up in?
Yeah.
Wow. And so do you remember him talking about Spider-Man or Doctor Strange or any of those characters?
Well, that gets into a little bit longer story, but no, he didn't. When he came back, he gave instructions to all the relatives to not talk about business. He was coming home for vacation, and that's what he did. So, I mean, his comics were always around the house. And I read them, but you know what? I was a kid. I didn't even know he did them. Not until I was probably an early teenager, but they were always around, and I knew he could draw. I always asked him to draw things. But no, we didn't talk shop, and we didn't actually know what he did as a kids.
That's really interesting. That is very cool. And this was the 6 months after Amazing Fantasy. The first issue of Amazing Spider-Man came out, also drawn by Kirby, who was drawing the flagship Fantastic Four, and so it made sense that Jack would draw it and Steve would ink it, and they'd worked together like that a lot over the years. And of course, just like you would put Spider-Man on a cover in later years, and this one they put the Fantastic Four on to sell the comic. Stan put it on the cover to sell the book. I guess this will be the first Spider-Man cover that Steve drew, penciled and inked himself, and what a knockout! I mean, those just the perspective and and Stan with the usual ballyhoo, yeah. How could you not buy it?
Hey, you know what? Can I throw something in on this one?
Sure.
So my uncle wrote. When he left Marvel in the mid '60s, late '60s. he ended up taking a bunch of notes at that time on what he could remember and recall on what happened with Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, and the Hulk and his work. And he specifically talked about this one at the Vulture, that he wanted, Stan wanted the Vulture to be fat. And who's that, the Sidney Greenstreet, and wanted him to be really heavy. And my uncle was like, no, I really think it's the opposite. He should be lean. And he kind of joked that Stan wanted a flying turkey, but what my uncle ended up doing was, a leaner, more thinner Vulture. But Stan really wanted him to be bulkier. He thought bulkier was more of a villain.
Well, Stan finally, like 4 years later, Stan got the Kingpin with with Romita.
Exactly.
Got his fat villain.
Yep.
And this is after about 2 years or so, maybe not even, of Spider-Man, they had enough villains, the Sandman and Dr. Octopus and Kraven, Electro, and the Vulture, to have an annual with this, again, Stan and Steve. They did all sorts of stuff that, had not been done in comics, in superhero comics before, having Spider-Man go to a psychiatrist, having him go mad, and just look, your uncle's vision on this, his way of just laying out, if you didn't, you would not need the copy, no Spider-Man goes mad, but the copy hammers it home. So I'm just giving a little potpourri of Steve stuff here. Just incredible. Essentially it's a six panel page, and most of the page is empty space, and it just hits you in the head. This was the second annual, or teamed up with Steve's two creations, Doctor Strange and Spider-Man. At this point, Steve was getting plotting credit as well as drawing credit. And again, it's just gorgeous stuff. But Steve did leave over various disagreements. And John Romita Sr. Started a family tradition by, John had been drawing stuff and he took over Spider-Man, and they did this story that as a kid, I'm sure a lot of us remember that whole thing of Spider-Man's unmasked, the Green Goblin's unmasked. And this is Stan and John, maybe 10 years after that. This is them in the mid-70s. But there's John Romita Sr. and Stan with one of his better toupees, I think, actually. This was
enough of the toupees, all right?
Okay. Well, mine. Okay. And this was part two of that. They knew that Steve leaving was potentially going to be lose readers, and so they just pulled out all the stops with the Green Goblin and Spider-Man. This is the splash page of that first issue. How green was my goblin? Stan, you get, there's only one Steve and there's only one Stan. And this is one of the most memorable Lee Romita pages, where Mary Jane Watson, who had been kind of hinted at in Steve's issues, was revealed. And I think the implication the whole time was that she was not very attractive, and of course, it turns out.
No.
What, Tom? What do you think?
No, they hinted that she was that she was a bombshell.
Did they? But
yeah.
Peter was afraid. Peter was afraid that she.
Peter was afraid, but Betty saw her, Liz saw her, and they were really jealous.
Good point. But they always did make a point of not showing her face. Or Steve always made a point of not showing her face.
Right.
But okay. And then this is maybe one of the most famous Spider-Man covers, and certainly the most famous Romita Spider-Man cover was Spider-Man No More. Spoiler alert: he went back to being Spider-Man. He didn't actually.
What?
I'll flip. These are Stan and John. So other incarnations of Spider-Man in the newspaper strip, Stan and John Romita did it for years. A name that's often forgotten, but because he was my first boss and a pal, Larry Lieber actually drew some Spider-Man, but spent 35 years drawing the newspaper strip. So so Larry has probably done more Spider-Man continuously than anybody. Then it was time for the next generation of Romitas, and I know I'm leaving tons of stuff out. Just what are you going to do? So John Romita Jr., who I don't know, this must be some kind of record, along with his father. Came in the 80s and then into the 90s and 2000s, and now this is the issue that came out this week, or is it out yet? So he's evolved and developed. I mean, it's he's gone away, he's come back, but that's quite a legacy. Tom, here's somebody you might know. This is The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man. It's a story that's fondly remembered. Ron Friends drew it. Tom did not write it though. Roger Stern wrote it. But Tom, it was initiated when you were editor, and then when the transition from when you became executive editor and I became the Spider-Man.
Yeah.
There's a story. People, although oddly enough, it's out on Assistant Editors Month, so it's credited to my assistant, Bob DiNatale.
Yeah. Roger had pitched the story to me. He said, I have this story, but there's no place to publish it. And I said, well, tell me the story. He told me the story. And I said, I don't care. Just write the plot. I'm going to buy it. And I'll stick it in an annual or something. I'll find a place to publish it. And then eventually it came out in Assistant Editors Month, and somebody else got the credit.
Well, now the truth can be told.
Yeah, who cares?
And then cut to right around this period, Spider-Man got this black costume that everybody in the office was convinced would be a big bomb. And
is that true?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Tom, tell us.
Everybody thought it was going to be a disaster. We actually, I've told this story again and again, but at one point, our guy from the mailroom came in with, it was either 1 sack of mail or 2 sacks of mail, dropped it on my desk and said, whatever you did, don't ever do it again. And it was all these readers who were swearing that they were never going to buy Spider-Man again. They were never going to buy another Marvel comic again. This thing was considered to be the biggest disaster we had ever done. At one point, Jim Shooter came to me and said, what issue does Spider-Man get his new costume? And I said, 252. He says, get rid of it in 253. And I convinced him that we had to at least wait until he got the costume in Secret Wars. But I remembered at one point he said to me, if sales on Spider-Man tank, it's going to be your butt. And I was thinking, yeah, I'm only the fill-in writer anyway.
You're only writing an issue or two.
Well, I thought I was only the fill-in writer for a couple of issues. I didn't know I was going to stick around.
Well, you stuck around, and then there was all sorts of to do with the costume, and
yeah.
It was evil. It was, but obviously it turned out to be an enormous hit, both as itself, and a great cover by Friends and Rubinstein. Holy cow! And then, oh my God, it was alive.
Yeah.
You're wearing a highly evolved symbiote. Well, so, but then you finally did get rid of it, and you and Ron.
And then we were told to bring it back.
And then I guess somewhere along the line, somebody decided to, I guess, Michelini and Todd and Sally, this is one of those successes that has many parents, but the living
It was mainly Michelini, because Dave wrote it up in a plot, described the character exactly the way he first appeared. And, if you look at the original plot, you see everything that is Venom. Todd didn't know Venom was coming until he got the plot.
We always knew that the suit would come back somehow, but
oh yeah,
in a specific way. Yeah, it was too good an entity. But yeah, the specific Venom thing. And then Venom begat Carnage, and this is from Mark Bagley's run with first with David and then with J.M. DeMatteis. And in the Stan tradition, I loaded the cover with all sorts of copy because, you can't have too much to read on a cover. Um, and Todd went off to his own Spider-Man playground, which people seem to like. It seemed to sell a few copies. But he's not on the panel. So Todd handed the scepter to Eric Larson. And again, despite how busy the cover was, I was still going to jam 6 blurbs on it. It might not have sold without those blurbs.
You need cover copy.
You do.
It rivets the eye, makes the eye, stay on the cover a little longer.
Commits the reader. And then in that same period, we had this is a cover drawn by Alex Saviuk, but inked by Eric Larson. This was and here's Sal Buscema, who again is another guy who's done a ton of Spider-Man. That's just J.M. DeMatteis, who did this long run with Sal. And then, the story that went completely unnoticed, we had the Scarlet Spider and the Clone. And again, there was no controversy and no bump in sales. And it just, and it never became a product or a movie. One thing that came out of that Clone saga, Tom, you and Ron Friends, came up with Spider-Girl, which was a little engine that kept it going for about 5,000 issues, right?
Well, it lasted 13 years.
And that was a great promotional gimmick, having it always be on the verge of cancellation. And then Mr. Bendis came along and reinvented the Spider-Man mythology. What was that like, Brian? I mean, that must have been a little bit of a challenge.
It was crazy. Well, it was. I had spent so many years trying to break into Marvel, and we all had that phase in our life where like just look any gig, anything you want, I want it. And then to go from that and knocking on the door for a decade and no one cares, and then all of a sudden someone turns to you and go, hey, what do you think about starting Spider-Man over from scratch? It's a project we've been working how about go on the main stage? So it was a project that was already in production before anyone there knew my name. There was other writer attached to it who was struggling with the idea, struggling in a way I would have struggled if I didn't get to see what he had done. Which is because Amazing Fantasy 15 is a perfect piece of fiction. It's not broken. So you're asking me to fix something that's not broken. And then I heard Stan gave a quote about how he had 11 pages to tell the Spider-Man story because that's all the publisher would give him. And he wished he had more. And that kind of freed me up in my heart to tell the same story, but over 7 issues. And we were off and running.
Now, did this come before the first Spider-Man movie, or how did those?
It was just before, but it was they were in production at the same time. I was brought to see a cut of the movie on a couch with Stan, who was seeing it for the first time as well, in Sam Raimi's office. So I was already the writer of Spider-Man at the time. I was being brought in with some kind of a Spider-Man brain, and the reason I was brought in is that Sam Raimi realized that, having read what we had done, that we had basically the same job: take this classic literature and adapt it to modern time, right? And we made our choices and he made his choices, and there were similarities and there were not similarities, and yeah, so that it was a fascinating time because it was definitely in the wind. It's time for Spider-Man to be celebrated. And also the company was in bankruptcy.
Right.
People forget that. And when I tell it now, it's so funny. Tell it now, people say, what? That sounds insane, because Marvel is the tentpole of all of pop culture. But when I was hired, the lights were off and they were selling furniture for money, and that's not a joke. They really were. And part of the reason me and my friends got in to make comics at Marvel is a lot of people left, and so yeah, so they needed Spider-Man to like become what it was supposed to become again, to save their ass and to get things going. And that's where Joe and Bill Jemas just did a magnificent job, helping turning it around.
So you hadn't seen the screenplay before you started writing the?
No. I had seen what they had done, literally sitting on the couch with Stan without the special effects in. It was just, and to get to see Stan's like emotional reaction to seeing the movie come to life in his lifetime was quite something. That was my takeaway from that day.
Incredible. Wow. Okay. And then Dan Slott's not here, but you can't really ignore the 10 years Dan Slott did. So I've got a few Dan Slott related images. So Dan, you should have been on the panel, but here, and then the Superior. So,
but this was an amazing time because these were running parallel to each other, Ultimate Spider-Man and Brand New Day Spider-Man. So we got to like no matter what you liked about Spider-Man, we had something for you. It was, and if you don't like it, fine. It worked out pretty great.
Well, that's one of my favorite Tom DeFalco quotes, which I'm sure, when somebody asked you once, aren't 4 monthly Spider-Man books too many? And your response was, not for somebody who loves Spider-Man.
Hey, Danny, can I interject something?
Sure. Inject.
Yeah, just to back it up a little bit, I was looking for the quote in my uncle's essays. Did you know that Stan wanted to have, or maybe you do know, that he wanted to put Spider-Girl, Spider-Woman in right around issue 3?
Oh, wow.
It made sense, but Steve didn't want to do it.
Right. He said no. They said, Michael he has a whole essay on all the questions that he had that Stan didn't have answers to. Like, where did she come from? Are they is this a team? Is this a Batman and Robin thing? Who's the leader? Are they friends? Do they know each other? All these questions that Stan didn't have any answers to when they were still fleshing out who Spider-Man actually even was. Right. So he just, this was one of those instances where they're in these talking sessions and Stan throws out an idea and my uncle just rejects it. He just says, no.
I'm sure Stan and Martin also didn't want to get caught by having like Carlton come out with a Spider-Girl or I think there was that look at the marketplace too, but probably could have been thought out more than just the name.
But also Spider-Girl related, I must say, Tom kept that universe alive for a very long time, and the passion that the readers felt about it was all around us all the time. And it was very influential about how we built the Ultimate Universe. And it just, even though we built something different, it's like, oh, that's what you need to do. Like, it's not just the characters, it's almost a whole Marvel universe around that character. And that was very inspiring to us because we saw, oh, that's how you keep a book alive.
Well, and I think at that time they were, my uncle was still trying to focus on Spider-Man. Who is he? And wasn't ready to like interject this whole other variable.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I think your uncle was right about a lot of things.
Yeah. And, having worked with Stan for a lot of years, Stan would just throw out, 10 or 20 ideas in the course of 5 minutes. And he'd reject most of them 5 minutes later. So he was always throwing out, hey, what if we did this? What if we did that? What if we did the other thing? And, Stan was, I always refer to Stan as an idea factory because the ideas would just roll out one after the other. By the way, Miles Morales was brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
Brilliant.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. That means a lot.
And I still think the first Spider-Verse movie is the best of all the Spider-Man movies.
Well, John might have an opinion on what the first Spider-Verse movie is.
Well, you did the thing that I think everyone does, which is you sort of leaped to Brian's work with Ultimate as being the first real reinvention of the Spider-Man mythos. But really, the 90s cartoon show was the first time where we really kind of had to rethink Spider-Man from the ground up, at least as far as the screen is concerned. And I can talk about that a little bit later. But I had Stan's involvement. I brought in a lot of the original writers for the comic book. I had Jerry Conway write the pilot script. I had Marv Wolfman involved for a while. And we really had to kind of radically rethink. This was the first time that we were going to bring Spider-Man to the screen pretty much the way that he was in the comic book. In fact, all of those significant comic book covers that you showed, I had the pleasure of bringing to life. So, I did the black suit. I did the kid who loved Spider-Man. I got to reinvent all of them for the screen. And then you mentioned the Raimi film. I know firsthand that many of the people involved in that film were given episodes of my series to watch in order to sort of get them up to speed on who the characters were. So there is, obviously the comic book is the most important platform, but there is a kind of it definitely had an effect.
Well,
For sure.
we all of us here, agree that the comic is the most important, but in that it sort of generates a lot of most of the ideas. But how many people how many millions of people watch your cartoon?
That's the point. A successful comic book is how many 100,000 comics,
right?
Whereas a failed TV series is a million viewers. If I get a million viewers, it gets yanked off the air. We were the #1 children's show on Saturday morning for kids in America for 3 years. We fought back and forth between X-Men and my show. We were frequently alternating between 1 and 2. So millions of kids were introduced to Spider-Man through my series, while at the same time I was adapting and reinventing comic book stories so that, I might take a story that we knew really well, like Turning Point, and adapt it for the screen. But I tried to keep it rooted in what had been done in the comic book. So these kids were being introduced not only to the character, but also to the world that had existed in the comic book. And that was what made my series unique, was that we really were attempting to do the comic book. The best compliment that people ever gave to me was, it's just like the comic book.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting dynamic that goes on between the cartoon series and the comics.
And the movies and the Slurpee cups.
Yeah. And now what happens is I have 30-year-old men and women who come up to me, and I was the gateway to Marvel for them. The animated series, the X-Men and the Spider-Man animated series were the ones that got them to be comic book readers and buyers. And now they're the ones that are watching all the movies. So it's definitely an integral part.
Absolutely.
Thanks. So Brian, how did Miles Morales come about?
Well, we were cut to years later. Ultimate, the line itself is successful, and Ultimate Spider-Man is doing very well. And I say this because sometimes a lot of bold choices are made in comics out of desperation, but this wasn't. And I'm genuinely proud of that. With the conversation to create Miles, and should we, and can we, and does the world want this, all came about out of the genuine creative conversation of what else could we be doing and what more can we do. And part of it was the conversation that it has gone all over the world about representation. And I had some friends, I had long talks with friends from all walks of life about it, and with the help of David Walker and Joe Quesada, and we started putting together the building blocks of what Miles would be. And it was another kid got spider powers and looks at everything Stan built from just a different perspective. And I was, but I knew, being a bit of a pop culture professor, it was a bit of a minefield. No one was looking. Spider-Man's not broken, as I said earlier. No one was looking to fix it, and that's not what we were doing. So we were able to, just use the platform and of the alternate Marvel universe, of the Ultimate Universe, to really dig in and explore and build the character from scratch with Sarah Pichelli. And now I get to live a life every day. It's just a hug that never stops. Miles is a hug that goes on and on and on and on every day. I don't know how everyone else got through their pandemic. Anytime I felt that bubbling stress, I just go to the hashtag Miles Morales birthday cakes on Instagram. And there's just like kids all over the world having their Miles Morales themed birthday parties. And my heart would be all warm and cozy and I'd go back to a normal headspace. But it's constant and it's wonderful. It's unbelievable.
Thank you. So this is Fabrice Sapolsky's Spider-Man Noir, and Tom DeFalco and Larry Hama's Peter Porker, and Miles, and one of the versions of Peter, and of course in the Spider-Verse, which who saw this coming? Well, besides John Semper, who saw this coming?
That's right.
And
well, and the other good thing about this is that we all make comics for a living. So we've all lived our whole lives with people kind of getting it, not really. What do you do? How do you do? What? But when something like Spider-Verse hits as hard as it did, people kind of understand it. You know what I mean? Like so it's nice to have out there.
Well, and again, we did the Spider-Verse in the last 2 episodes of the animated series.
Yep.
So a whole
absolutely.
generation was already introduced to the idea of the Spider-Verse. You can imagine my surprise when I was watching the movie, which I had been told was a wonderful movie, and it was a fantastic movie, but I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, this story is starting to look very familiar. It really, it was a nice and pleasant surprise to see that this thing that we had done at the very end of the series now had a life of its own and continues to have a life of its own.
And John, just so clear, I never stake claim or of ownership or of creation of the Spider-Verse on any level. You or Dan Slott or anybody else who did it. I just had another Spider-Man over here.
Yeah, sure. No.
What I find hilarious about this is, of all the different varieties of Spider-Man, I mean, obviously there was controversy over the clone and Ben Reilly, but the thing that I remember taking the most flack for was the spider armor. And even I thought it was goofy, but I figured, what the hell, let's give them some toys and the spider, so that the spider armor not only survived but ended up in all these other medias.
Well,
totally.
Have you heard me tell the story about how I thought up this whole thing?
Well,
I didn't know that the spider armor had been in the comic. When I got the animated series, Spider-Man had been my favorite comic book character, but I had really stopped reading by the time I came out and started my career. So there was a whole lot that I had missed when I finally got the job of doing the show. And when Avi came out with the toy, the spider armor toy, I did not know that it had appeared in the comic book. And to me, it just seemed like a toy that was way out of left field. And I felt that kids they'd feel cheated if they bought the toy and they didn't see this character in our series. So I was trying to find a way to get a lot of these characters that had been made into toys, but had not actually appeared in the series, into the series quickly. And I only had a limited number of episodes. I did not want to go into very long character arcs with any of these Octo Spidey or Armored Spidey, but I wanted them to appear on screen so the kids who bought the toy would not feel cheated. When I was a kid, that really used to anger me. So that's how I came up with this idea of multiple Spider-Men from different dimensions fighting alongside one another. It was really, and specifically that Armored Spider-Man was the very germ of where that came from.
That's
amazing.
We did one of those fancy covers, with the embossing and the shiny silver ink. There it is. Maggie, hi.
Hi.
So I want you to, Maggie, you were of course way back. You were watching from day one as a fan, and then you became a professional fanzine editor and writer. How did all this evolution seem to you?
Well, I was going to point out that when Amazing Fantasy 15 came out, Tom DeFalco had just turned 12. And Mark Ditko was about 3. And Brian would be born in about 5 years. And one of the things that people don't grasp, I was talking with my daughter about this, and she said, you really need to make it clear. So when Amazing Fantasy 15 came out, Don and I had just gotten married. And we were in steamy Cleveland, Ohio, and it was hot and it was whatever. But what people don't realize is if you collected comic books in that era, in 1962, you had to go from store to store to store to store to find all the comic books that were out there. There was no one-stop shopping for comic books. So you'd look and you'd say, oh, that's interesting. And you'd grab whatever looked interesting. But Classics Illustrateds were not on the same stands as the Gold Keys or Dells or the whatever, or the DCs and whatever. You had to go, as I say, store to store. I would guess we visited 6 to 12, about 6 to a dozen stores in order to see all the comics that were out there. And so it went. So if you missed one, it was yikes. So if you look at when the direct market started, and I made a note somewhere, yes, it was 15 years later that the direct market came in and there were comic shops. So there were no comic shops when Amazing Fantasy 15 came out. You had to get caught by it. And then you watched it grow, and people would trade and so forth. And it was mostly kids. We were grown-ups, and that was an advantage that Don and I had, was that compared to everybody else, we were older. So folks like Stan would give us the time of day. And I will say though, that the first big multi-day comics convention was John Benson's convention in New York City, and Stan was so busy that he didn't come. So there were the representatives of Marvel at that convention were Roy Thomas and Flo Steinberg. And by the way, Flo was one of 4 females at that convention. I was one, Pat Lupoff was one, and Lee, great, I've forgotten her last name. She was an award-winning writer of Westerns. We were the 4 women there. And most of the attendees at that convention came up to our shoulders. There were all these little kids running around and trading comic books. And
Children reading comics, that's crazy.
I'm just saying. I'm just saying. This is what it was. But we had started getting interested in comics as an amateur production in 1960, yes. Dick and Pat Lupoff came to the World Science Fiction Convention as Fawcett's Captain and Mary Marvel, which, by the way, as we all know now, it's Shazam, because guess who now owns Marvel as a character title? But what happened was we were at the Worldcon and we were sitting there at the banquet and going, okay, we know who writes science fiction and fantasy and draws the illustrations, and we know the editors and whatever. Who does comic books? I mean, Walt Disney doesn't write or draw Walt Disney's comics and stories. And so we started to reach out, and thanks to the fact that there's editorial addresses and we were grown-ups, we got responses from the editors that the kids would dream of later and then go on to work professionally. Brian Michael Bendis, et cetera.
That's right. That's right.
Just saying. Yeah. So yeah, by the way, Don and I both did write some comic book stories, but we were more interested in doing the reporting. Don worked for the Cleveland Press for 23 years, and I did fanzines. And then
isn't it crazy, not to derail, that there isn't even an archive of the Cleveland Press? It's completely wiped away.
Tell me about it.
It's amazing to me. I'm from Cleveland too. That's why and I worked at the Plain Dealer. So
exactly.
It's just crazy to me. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
Anyway, I and also, Maggie, have you considered, or are you working on some sort of archive of the buyer's guide, or some kind of Taschen oversized coffee table book of your best of the best?
Of the best? No, because the current owners are, it's a Random House. And Penguin, I think that's right. At the 2019 Comic-Con, I tried to find an editor there to find at their booth to talk to them about what they have that they don't know they have. And because they had folded Comics Buyer's Guide before the kit and caboodle was sold. So for example, I had a concept of Parents' Guide to the Best Kids Comics that I think there's a market for today. And I would like to tell them about it because I think they could do a new edition. I will say, by the way, that throughout the history of Comics Buyer's Guide, when we joined Krause, we said you have to understand that we cannot buy all rights. We need to buy, and I came up with the term, perpetual but non-exclusive rights. So if we wanted to do a best of CBG, we could go ahead and do it, but nobody gave up the rights to what they created, because guess what? Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster really had suffered. So we said, why would anyone sell us an article if they had to give up all rights to what they were doing? So as I say, that was our contract, and there were a few people who did first time rights only. So somebody like Ron Goulart, somebody like Mark Evans sold us one time rights only. So in terms of doing a massive whatever, it would be cool. I will say that I think the most successful article that we ran was Who Killed Gwen Stacy? And that was a gentleman who is now a voice artist and just has made his own career somewhere else. But yes, and he did an investigative report. It was the writer.
Oh my God. Well, I mean, Maggie, I know you know this, but it goes without saying that your publication and all the work that you did was so important to my formation and all of my peers. We loved this publication, and it was our internet. It was our Twitter. That's where we found out everything. So
ours too, by the way.
Yeah.
Just saying. It's
So
being a journalist, and that was what we were hired to do. Chet Krause, before that it was mostly an advertising publication, and Chet Krause in rural Wisconsin already did collector publications. He, by the way, collected fire engines, and that was
like
his
real
hobby.
ones?
Yes. Oh yes.
Okay.
And yes, and he also collected one of every vehicle in his unit from World War II. So he not only had a tank, he had a tank recovery vehicle. So we all understood collectors. So there were coin collectors and trading card collectors, and he hired us to do a professional publication about comics, and it was a thrill. It was
well, thank you is what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
The Shmoo is looking on approvingly in your entire presentation over your shoulder. The Shmoo over your shoulder is enchanting. If anybody doesn't know what the Shmoo is, it's a AlCap creation. Google the Shmoo when you get a chance.
But one of the viewers just mentioned The Law is an Ass by Bob Ingersoll, which was Bob was someone who actually shopped at the store I worked at. So I got the Bob Ingersoll Law comic lectures all day long, and that absolutely informed my Daredevil run 100%. So thank you again.
But you can also still collect stuff. So for example, I have this guy behind me. So this is a Marvel Connection. We all know, right, what this is? Do we know?
No.
It's a Flurkin.
Oh,
It's a Flurkin. All right, it's a Kelly Sue Flurkin. Yeah.
It's done by Hasbro, which also did Peter Porker, the Spider-Ham back here.
Actually,
By the way, co-created by Mr. DeFalco, I point out.
so sorry, go on.
and Peter Porker was it was a dumb gag.
I loved it.
Yeah.
Not the only one, apparently. So that cover, by the way, the Spider-Man mystery. The mystery was what turned out to be the Clone Saga, but the art is by the late great Tom Lyle, who we know.
Yeah.
Just a wonderful Spider-Man artist. And so here's photos, some buyer's guides. It turned out if you Google, there's a lot of buyer's guides with Spider-Man on the cover. So just sort of to bring us into the home stretch here with the visual part, Spidey Super Stories. I think that was a lot of people's introduction to Spider-Man, and that was tied in with the electric company with Spider-Man, apparently chastising a room full of children. In the 70s, when John Belushi came up to visit the office, Spider-Man teamed up with the not ready for primetime players, who returned the favor by, I don't even know what era of SNL. Anybody know what year?
Golden years. This is like 76, 77. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there was definitely interplay between them. Here's the Spider-Man show with, I'm blanking on the actor's name. Who was the guy?
Hammond.
Christopher Hammond.
Hammond,
Yeah.
right? That was an
Very,
early,
very lovely gentleman, by the way. I've met him a couple of times.
the very original Does Whatever a Spider-Man Grant Ray Lawrence show. Was
This
that
the Grant Ray Lawrence that Ralph Bakshi was involved with?
right? And this is from the 80s, a blurry picture from the Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends.
Oh, good Lord, was this important to me?
Yeah. Yes, he was the perfect age.
Right on the money.
And the dog is not, the poodle is not in the in the photo. And this might be the most important Spider-Man brand extension of all time. I didn't even know there were so many Slurpee cups. Toys, of course, toys forever.
Well, you know, what's interesting is they're still making toys based on my series. They've got like a whole new wave. Hasbro's got a whole new wave of toys that are specifically based. If you go back to that first image you showed,
Right.
you know, that's our packaging, and they're still manufacturing toys now based on our designs and our packaging. So I find that kind of interesting. I'm quite enthusiastic, quite
Well,
excited about that.
You should be. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That new logo was kind of daring. You know, that was the first really different Spider-Man logo in a.
We designed that in our studios. You know, they created a studio called Marvel Films Animation. And the whole idea was that it was going to be the main studio that was going to animate everything Marvel from that point on. And that logo, which was drawn by Del Barris, was created in our studio at the very beginning of the development of our series.
Wow. Well, I mean, it's just one of 10 gazillion toys. And Maggie, this is actually yours, because I
Yeah.
put the photo up and I just blew it up. But that is part of Maggie's collection. And you know, video games, which nobody, including me, ever talks about, which is an astonishingly huge business. There's a lot of Spider-Man video games.
Yeah.
And the Miles game and this Spider-Man 2 have sold more copies than we'll ever read all the comic books combined. It's an insane number, like 80 million.
Well, and I don't know, Maximum Carnage was big, and I mean, that was a storyline that I certainly didn't imagine that that it would become what it did with the video games. There's been a bunch of movies. Maybe you heard about them. Here's a few of the guys from the movies. And then I thought I would wrap up this with just one of the most famous sequences in comics ever, drawn and plotted by Mark's Uncle Steve. So this is this has been homaged a million times in comics, in movies, maybe, you know, in your backyard, but this is Spider-Man beating the unbeatable foe, fighting the unfightable fight, the unwinnable fight.
I had the honor of bringing this to life too.
Anyone can win a fight when the odds are easy. It's when the going's tough, when there seems to be no chance, that's when it counts. That's right. These 4 pages really define the character, you know, and thank you, Stan and Steve. And that is the end of the, I'm going to stop sharing now. And
All right. And with that, Danny, I'm so sorry, but the only thing I love more than Spider-Man is my children. So I have to go.
you're doing the right thing.
I have to go watch a karate belt test. I deeply appreciate spending this time with all of you for
Thank
many different reasons. And also, Mark, I can't wait to watch that comic historian piece on you. I have a lot of questions. I feel they're all going to be answered there. So thank you,
Feel free to
everyone.
reach out to me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Brian.
you, Brian.
All right.
See
It's
you.
great to talk to you again, John and Tom and Maggie. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Great seeing you, Brian.
Hi, so let's see. I have not been tracking the questions. I got some. Tom, I wanted to ask you. You were the first editor to actually put all the Spider-Man books together as like under one editor.
Yeah,
Why do you think? I mean, I guess the line had grown. How did that? Whose idea was that? How did that come about, and how did that affect the character?
you know, it was Jim Shooter's idea. I was kind of hired as a temporary editor because Jim was reorganizing the editorial department, and he asked me if I could come on staff as an editor. And around that time, I had been working at Archie about two days a week, and I said, Jim, I'm essentially a freelancer. I haven't had a full-time job in years. And he says, but I needed, I know you got editorial experience. Just come on for about 6 months. So I thought, oh, yeah, I could do anything for 6 months. So I joined Marvel with the idea that I would only be there, again, temporary. How many times these temporary jobs that just last forever. At the time, he said to me, what do you think is the worst title Marvel does? And I said, well, at the time I said, Ghost Rider. He says, good, I'm going to give you Ghost Rider. I thought, okay, I'm going to probably get all the crummy titles. And then he said to me, and we're going to give you all the. And I said, wait a minute, I'm the new guy. I shouldn't get the Spider-Man titles. You should give it to somebody with experience. And he said to me, Spider-Man is just like Archie, just with superpowers. And the more I thought about it, I thought, yeah, he's kind of right. Yeah, it's all the soap opera stuff. So, I, got the titles. Nobody had there weren't regular teams on any of the books. And I just went out and, got to choose the guys that I wanted to choose, put them on the books. And we brought everybody together and said, I want everybody to coordinate. I want everybody to get along. Because up until then, Amazing Spider-Man had all the good villains. And whoever writing Spider-Man would hoard all the villains. Wouldn't let them appear in Spectacular, or wouldn't let them appear in Team Up. And I said, that stuff is over. A Spider-Man villain is a Spider-Man villain. And we're just going to coordinate everything. And I told everybody that they had to read, whenever I would get a plot, I'd send it to all the other writers and all the artists, and made sure that everybody was looking at what everybody else was doing. And I didn't realize, but I guess nobody had done anything like that before.
I don't think anybody had done anything like that. I mean, were they doing it at DC with Batman and Superman? Or
I don't think so.
Not really, no.
No. So I just thought, hey, let's all coordinate. Because when I was working at Archie, we were all kind of looking at each other's stuff and seeing if we could make something funnier than the other guy. And I thought, hey, let's make sure that everybody's looking at everybody else's stuff. Because one of the problems in comic books is you're working so hard and you're putting in so many hours, you don't have time to look at all the other comic books.
Right. So
I said, if you're going to work on Spider-Man, you have to read the other Spider-Man books so that we're all, on the same page. And then once I established that, by the time you took over, having Spider-Man meetings, regular Spider-Man meetings where all the writers came in was just, there's some everybody was used to doing.
And it was a lot. It was a lot of fun. I mean, there are worse things you could do than get together in a fancy hotel and eat good food and talk about Spider-Man. The greatest thing that ever happened to me was at a Spider-Man creative conference once. We had rented a conference room in a hotel on the 34th Street, and the phone rings, and it's the front desk, and they said the conference room next door is complaining that we're making too much noise. And I'm going, yeah, I'll take care of it. And it's like, I was so happy. It was because that meant that everybody was so excited and so engaged and so into what they were doing. It was like, yeah, I'm not going to pass that message along, but thank you for the information. It's, it was one of the high points I remember.
I know that I loved them as, I when I was the editor, I didn't love them as much because I, had to be the authority figure. But once I became a writer on one of the books and got to coordinate with all the other guys and stuff, I really love those meetings. I look forward to them.
Well, kind of in a way, we still sort of have mini versions of them now. We just, we still get together on Zoom. I want to ask Mark, what, I mean, I know your uncle only passed away a few years ago. Did he? And I know he was not fond of looking back, but how did he feel about this? I mean, the whole whatever the Spider-Man plex. This how did he? I mean, it goes back to he and Stan doing these 5-page fantasy stories, and then they're doing a superhero, and then it becomes this industry. I mean, did he ever talk about that, or could you ever kind of intuit what he was thinking?
Yeah, in our letters back and forth, I started to get back into comics around the 89 and started going to Comic Cons. So when we started to write back and forth around 89, 90, there were, I didn't restrain myself. I would write whatever I felt like. I mean, I had met Jack Kirby a couple times and Stan and others and, Jim Shooter. So when I had conversations with them, I'd relay it and I would write those, in the letters. But, this is one of those things in hindsight. I wish I was even more involved in what he had done, because I would probably be asking him all the questions that people really wish they would have asked him, at the time now that you can't, or that they didn't. So, it wasn't something that he ever talked about. It wasn't something that, and primarily he was my uncle, so we really didn't, and the comic thing literally was just like a sideline. It wasn't the primary dialogue that was going on between us. We talked mostly philosophically, or based on the family. We talked about world conditions. We talked about, philosophy, and he would send me books, and, I'm kind of a philosopher at heart myself, so we connected that way. And relative to family in the comics was just, hey, when you did the Creeper, this or that, or something. So it wasn't something that in my conversations with him, it was never anything taboo. No matter what I said, he loved, anybody that knew him loved, that he loved the dialogue. He loved to have conversations, even if it was a sensitive one, or that you might see sensitive. The thing about him is, he would keep on talking. He would keep on going. He would keep on, communicating about it. And as long as you did, he was always trying to reach, some level of understanding, I guess, or maybe he just enjoyed the dialogue, so there was nothing that was really taboo. And I wish I would have brought up more, but I never really did. But there's one quote that he said that I think really epitomizes who he was. And he says, he wrote to me in 1991, and he said, "Past achievements can be a trap if anyone believes he can live on what he did yesterday or last month, knew yesterday, etc. Past achievements can become excess baggage." And that's what he saw. He was a forward-moving, forward-looking person. And believe it or not, his philosophical grounding, look, he had 90 years to refine that. And literally, he didn't care. He just didn't care. It wasn't important to him what people had done. He said, movies are not comics, all that stuff. It's a different media. It really has nothing to do with him. It's moved way beyond where he was with it. So, he didn't really have any, animosity or regret or have any necessarily thoughts. I think he was very neutral on it. It was just something that someone else was doing.
I remember when the Spider-Man musical was out with all the soap opera involved with that production. But I remember thinking it must, and maybe I'm wrong. I was just thinking it must be odd for Steve to have his office like on 45th Street, on 40. I mean, his office was like 2 blocks from the theater with Spider-Man, and I wonder if he ever walked past it or,
Hey, you know what? Okay, so just recently, when where he lived, his studio was on one side of 51st Street, and his apartment was on the other side at 7th. And he would walk down past right on the corner. There was a gift shop, and the windows are just full of all kinds of Marvel merchandise. Every day he walked past that, every single day. He probably just didn't think much of it,
Way to one thing about his interaction with fans. So when Spider-Man started, we wrote a fan letter to Stan, and we said how amazing Steve Ditko's art was, because if you looked at his routine comics, his whether they were fantasies or action or whatever, his civilian characters were fairly rigid, fairly stiff. And what he did with Spider-Man was he had a counterpoint to that. And we commented that if you look at the Vulture, for example, the sweep of the wings, or Doc Ock and the sweep of the tentacles, and the amazing contrast that was to the background characters, we said how brilliant that was of Steve Ditko to do the art that way. And Stan passed our fan letter on to Steve. We didn't write to Steve. Stan passed him the letter, and Steve wrote to us directly with a gift, because that's what he did. And then when Dr. Strange came along, but it was the same thing. So it was the casting the spell was in contrast to the routine day in, day out characters. It was suddenly like you're in a fantasy land with, Strange, the windows as behind Danny there. Very, very designed.
I might be in Wildwood Cemetery.
I was just going to say, yes. So the brilliant self-knowledge of using his own art style against his own art style in order to create an impact was just incredible. And then his kindness to fans who wrote fan letters was also incredible.
That's one thing that, so he did this essay series called A Mini History that he did from his notes in the 60s. And it's 16 essays. It may be 40 pages or something. The one takeaway that I get from that is how much thought he put into what he did. He did not do things haphazardly. Everything was very intentional. He mapped out, he was a phenomenal illustrator. He knew what he had in his head and how to portray that in sequential art. He was a master at that. And he obviously, over the decades and decades, he had refined that more and more. So yeah, he was, and the one thing that I always want to impress on people is this wasn't a fluke what he did. He was a master at what he did. He was really, really good.
Oh, yes, he was. Yes, he was, a premier visual storyteller, the likes of which, there's only been a handful of guys that could touch Steve.
Jerry Robinson saw it just when he was starting there at the school. Jerry Robinson saw that in him as someone who was a novice. Yeah.
Did you get to meet Jerry and speak with him?
No.
He was Jerry was pretty amazing too. We can talk more about, or actually, I did a lot of people did interviews with Jerry, and he talked. You know, Jerry was very articulate, so get a sense of him. I want to, John, you actually worked maybe more even than Tom, and certainly more than me, I think, with Stan on an almost daily basis.
Yeah, I knew Stan pretty well.
Yeah, so what did he ever reflect or talk about Spider-Man in particular, or anything relevant to this this panel?
I only really, it's funny, things come to me in bits and pieces. We had a lot of talks, we had a lot of conversations, because I had known Stan, I had met Stan 10 years prior to working on the animated series. I had worked at a company called Marvel Productions, where we had mostly done Hasbro stuff. And Stan had a back office in that building, and I was in awe of Stan. And I was thrilled to be able to hang out in the same building with him. And we became pretty good friends. And we used to have a lot of long philosophical talks about, what it would take to bring the characters to the screen and how frustrating it was that we weren't able to do that. And my mind is so full of all the things that were going on back in those days that I only remember bits and pieces. I know that he was very upset about the proposed Cameron film. The idea that Spider-Man's webbing came from his wrists without there being a contraption, that really bothered him. He did not like that. And he admitted it quietly to me. That was when there was going to be a Jim Cameron movie and everyone was excited about it. Stan didn't want to rock the boat, but that was something that bothered him. We had a lot of discussions. The thing about Stan was that he didn't really understand how to write for the screen. And so I'm listening now. I digitized, I copied, I recorded every one of our creative meetings.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I have hours and hours and hours and hours of creative meetings on Spider-Man, the animated series. And I'm listening back to them now as I'm digitizing them. And mostly he's beating me up mercilessly because he was not one for subtly laying in underlying themes or parallel storytelling, or sometimes I was trying to set something up that I wanted to do 10 episodes later. I wanted to pay up 10 episodes later, and he'd be really angry with me. Why is Harry in this episode? He's only in it for 5 minutes. Why is he there? John, we have to have action. It's got to be action. So everything with Stan was action, and we got into a lot of fights about that, very, very amiable fights. No, Stan was I think, a really wonderful storyteller. I enjoyed tremendously working with him. I think that when we did the animated series, he was a little bit done with animation and he really didn't want to be that involved. So the fact that he had to be involved was a little frustrating for him. And as soon as he could get out of it, he wanted to be done with it. So I really only had him for the first 13, but he was very involved with the first 13. And I still have all the notes that he gave me. And he mostly hated just about everything I was doing. But we kind of, there was a meeting of the minds. Listen, the great thing about Stan is that he had the guts to hire a young Black guy to handle this marquee property. He's the one who brought me in, and no one else would have hired me to do that job at that particular time. So the fact that he was willing to hand this tremendous property over to me, I always felt obligated to do the best that I could to bring it to life. And as I said, I did all of those covers. One of the first things that I insisted upon when I took the show was, please buy me a complete library. I don't care if they're used issues. I don't need to have pristine issues. Just get me a full library so that I can peruse the covers, the stories, and do the best job bringing these things to life. And I think that he was really pleased with what we had done. I remember him coming to me once and saying that he was a little nervous about the show. And then the pilot aired when he was at a convention. So he got to watch it with a whole group of fans, and they were extremely enthusiastic, and he was extremely excited about that. So I was happy to deliver to him a success. That was something that was personal between us, and I felt very good about that.
Well, you know, he and Steve also argued, and the results were
Yeah.
pretty good. So,
Yeah.
you know, maybe that's how you get something of that lasts out.
Oh, Stan and I argued constantly, and the great thing about it was that at some point he'd just give in. He'd say, well, you do what you want to do, you know, you do best. And I think that there was a huge amount of stress at the beginning of the show. I've gone on about this at other interviews. By the time I got hired on, I was not the first producer, story editor. They fired the first one. By the time I came on, they were on the verge of the show not getting on the air. And I had nothing to work from, because part of their deal with the previous story editor producer was that they could not use any of his material. So literally from the day that I arrived, I had 4 weeks to get the show up and running. And they felt so burned at that point by writer people that they were really very angry with me without me having done anything. You know, I just represented writer people. So it was a rough beginning, but Stan was very supportive, and he would tolerate me arguing with him. You know, we had known each other for a while, and I could argue. So yeah, we had a good relationship.
Thank you, John. Tom, do you remember any discussions about Spider-Man with Stan or Steve?
Oh, not with Steve. You know, it's I guess my relationship with conversations with Steve kind of are like Mark's relationship with conversations, because, you know, the first time I spoke to Steve was when we were working together on Machine Man, and then later on when I became an editor, if you remember, I used to have a coffee pot in the office and would bring in donuts. So a lot of freelancers would stop for free coffee and donuts, and Steve was one of them. And we would have all sorts of conversations. And I realized later on, we never once discussed comic books. We discussed movies, we discussed, you know, recent books we had read, or articles in the newspaper, political events, that sort of stuff. Never once discussed comic books. The closest I ever had to a real discussion of comic books was one time I arranged, Stan was going to come up with a new property, and I arranged for Steve and Stan to meet together and to discuss the philosophy of this new series, which Steve ultimately passed on. But, you know, that was the only time I ever remember sitting there discussing, you know, comic books.
No, I'm at that meeting. I mean, you know, again, from what it seems that after that, the relationship kind of went south. But this was in the early 90s, and I wasn't in that meeting, but I was standing outside watching it. And these certainly seemed to be two guys who were, you know, I could
We
only
were very happy to see each other.
very happy to see each other. They hugged, you know, I mean, it was
Oh
really,
yeah, no. As soon as Stan saw Steve, he ran up to him and you know, Stan was a hugger, so he gave him a big hug, and then Steve hugged Stan back, and they looked at each other. They're holding, you know, hugging each other, smiling, and you know, it was just you know, it was just so great to see the two of them together, you know, having a fun conversation and discussing different ideas for a new series. Of course, afterwards,
well,
I had one of the most surreal moments of my life as you know, Steve left, and I'm walking with Stan, and Stan turns to me and says, "Tommy, could you explain to me why Steve left Spider-Man?" And I said, I think I was in high school at the time, Stan. I have no idea why.
Anyway, we are running close to our allotted time, so I want to give anybody a chance to have a last statement about Stan, Steve, Spider-Man.
Aren't you going to take any of the questions?
I guess, you know,
While you're looking and vamping, I just want to say to Mark that I was a huge fan of Steve Ditko, and he was a huge inspiration for me. I've told you this before in person, I'm sure, but I'll say it publicly. And one of the things that I absolutely knew I wanted to do, and nobody asked me to do it, I just wanted to do it, was to bring Doctor Strange to life in the series, because I had been such a fan of the Doctor Strange comic book as drawn by your uncle. So there, I just wanted to get that out.
Appreciate it, John.
Frank Lovis has a question, Mark, about was your uncle comfortable at the end of his life? Was he doing okay?
He was fine. You know, that was something that, in fact, that was one of the guys, Greg, I can't remember his Weish or something. He posted some video when Michael had first passed away and just went on a rant about he was alone and it shouldn't have been that way, and on and on and on. It was a knee-jerk reaction. It wasn't like that at all. The whole family, he was in touch with the family the whole year. Everybody, you know, we knew when he went in the hospital. We knew when he was coming out. We knew he wasn't doing well. I mean, he was fine. You know, he had his apartment, he had his studio, he was well set up, he had his routine. You know, it was just in the last year, he, you know, his health just deteriorated. But prior to that, he was fine. You know, there was nothing that he wanted that he didn't have.
Good.
And the family was constantly there for him. And all, hundreds of people writing to him every year. You know, he stayed in touch with so many people. So he was not alone. You know, he wasn't, angry at the world. He wasn't, withdrawn. He wasn't none of that stuff. He was just getting older.
I'd just like to point out that I'm all of those things.
I'll combine a couple of questions, and then I think that'll be the last. And Tom, I think this would be a good one for you and for me, and partly. You know, I know Steve obviously would always politely refuse to do Spider-Man or Doctor Strange. Did you ever talk to him about that, or try to get him to do it? And how did he end up doing? So, let's say with Speedball and stuff like that, he had no issues.
He had no issue doing anything except he just didn't want to repeat himself. And when we introduced Speedball, I was trying to figure out where we could introduce him, and I thought the best place is Spider-Man. I remember calling Steve up and asking him, would he have an objection if we did the first Speedball story in a Spider-Man annual? And the only question he said is, do you want me to draw Spider-Man? I said, no, Steve, I know you don't want to draw him. So I said, I would love for you to do it, but we just want to put him in the annual. And Steve said, sure, no problem, as long as I don't have to draw him. And I think that was the only time I ever discussed Spider-Man with him.
Yeah, you had better luck, because he had agreed, or at least said he would think about drawing a Prowler story in a Spider-Man annual, and then at the last minute he wasn't able to do it. I always wondered if he thought, hey, they're trying to trick me to do a Spider-Man story.
Well, no, I think, how could you trick somebody? I mean, if Spider-Man is in the story,
but it didn't. He ended up. But like I said, he drew. He drew this really one of the hardest things I ever wrote. It was an Avengers annual, and there were like 100 characters, and came through like a change. Klaus inked it. So I think now is at the time. Any last? Now it's time for last thoughts on.
Well, can I just toss in one thing, which was that I blanked on Scott Brick's name earlier when I said that one of the most popular things we ever ran was the Who Killed Gwen Stacy article, and I blanked on Scott Brick's name. He's a wonderful actor. He's a terrific voice performer, and I just didn't want this thing to end with my going, oh, I forgot his name. So just saying.
Okay.
Scott
Glad you
Brick.
bring that up. Okay.
And I would like to say one thing. 12-year-old Tom DeFalco did buy Amazing Fantasy 15 off the stands.
Nice.
He still has his copy. It is a ragged thing that would have to be improved terrifically to get up to poor condition, because he reread it so many times. It completely, like I say, the pages had to be stapled together and that sort of stuff. And when I need inspiration, I still go back to that.
Well, you beat me. I only got Amazing Spider-Man 1, so you were ahead of me. You know.
Oh,
I built an addition on my house with with Amazing Fantasy 15 and the first 100 issues of Spider-Man.
Wow.
And I will tell you that what it did was it protected the rest of my collection. But every time I go back to say, I just really want that Amazing Fantasy 15. And I think the rotten condition copy you're talking about now goes for about $5,000. Just
I'll tell you a funny story about comic book collections. When the show was announced, and it was announced with a different head writer, I came to the conclusion that I was never going to be able to do anything related to Marvel or Marvel superheroes. So I sold my collection. I did. I sold every Marvel comic I had, and I had all of almost a complete run of Spider-Man. I think I came in around issue 3 of Amazing Spider-Man. And I made a good chunk of dough. About 6 months later is when I got the call from Stan that he wanted me to come over and work on the show. And there's a strange kind of thing. I think spiritually, sometimes you have to let something go in order for it to come back in. I've never regretted selling the comic books because I really do think that it was what somehow karmically enabled me to have the show dropped in my lap. And the funny thing was that when I went to Avi Arad and said, you got to buy me a collection, I went back to the guy that I had sold my collection to and bought the collection back. I mean, it wasn't mine, but that was the collection that I bought back. So yeah.
This might be the ultimate comic fan story, This might be,
Yeah.
So Danny, I know you're trying to wrap this up, but you're talking about collections. I have to throw this in.
It's more up to society than me.
This is my classic one. So in the 90s, when I started to go to comic conventions, of course I was writing back forth with my uncle, and he knew that I was now interested in comics. So he started sending me his file copies. So every now and then I just get a box, and he would be sending me stuff. And one day I got this really nice box of Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man 5 through 38 with the annuals. And also I grew up with drawing Don Martin. I was a big fan of Mad Comics. So I'm a big fan of Don Martin. But he sent me his Mad #1 as well, which, why did he have that? I have no idea. But so I have all these Spider-Man comics. So I think, okay, this is in the 90s. Okay, I'm still, I can't say that I'm the smartest nephew. So I send them back and I ask him if he would sign them for me. You could imagine how that went over. Yeah. So he writes me back and he says, you are one lucky nephew. You know how close I came to throwing these things in the trash. He said, I'm sending them back unsigned. Consider yourself lucky.
But then did he sign the letter signed Steve Ditko?
No. But then maybe a month or so, a couple months later, he sent me the comic that he came out with, The Safest Place. And he sent me probably a dozen signed copies.
Well, everybody, as you say, there's that myth that Steve was a recluse. Steve corresponded with hundreds of people. And my all-time favorite Steve Ditko letter that I've ever seen, somebody wrote him for an autograph, and the letter is, I don't believe in autographs.
Yes.
Signed Steve Ditko. All right, look, let's wrap this up with a question. No more philosophy. Sean Kelly wants to know, who's your favorite Spider-Man villain? John?
Before I answer that, I want to say it's been an honor being on a panel with all of you. I am thrilled and delighted to be able to be here and do this. And Danny, thank you for inviting me. Okay. And my favorite.
That's a Mel Brooks phrase, thrilled and delighted, isn't it? Who was Stan's favorite comedian? Anyway, that's.
Yeah. My favorite villain would probably be the Green Goblin, because I loved doing that turning point, that whole turning point death of, you know, the girlfriend off the bridge. I love doing that in the series, and I loved reading it as a comic book, and I love bringing it to life. So it would have to be the Green Goblin.
Cool. Tom?
I guess it would have to be Dr. Octopus, because I think Dr. Octopus is who Peter would have been if he, you know, didn't understand that with great power, you know, should also come great responsibility. The two of them, you know, are such counterpoints to each other. You know.
Yeah. Thank you, Maggie.
It's tough. At the moment, I'm going to say Vulture, and it would switch in an hour. I'd switch it to somebody else. But for one thing, I do think that the live action movie with the Vulture totally worked in an unexpected way. So it sort of reminded me of how much I'd liked the character before. But as I say, give me an hour, it'll be somebody else.
And I'm going to say the Sandman, just because he's, that's like a great, I mean, hey, it's one of the top, one of the earliest ones. And it's just one of those elemental, oh, he turns into sand. That's, I mean, this is so beautiful and so simple. And I will let Mark take us out with what you have a favorite villain?
Well, it has to be issue 25, Doc Ock cover. It's the only one that I still have that I had as a kid. It's like Tom's, you know, Amazing Fantasy. It is so ratted and torn up. It's the only comic that survived that I have as a kid. And I just love that Doc Ock cover. And I actually ended up running into Stan and had him sign it. And I ran out to my uncle and visited and had him sign it. So I have this ratty Doc Ock 25 with both of them signed.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for making the time, for showing up. Thank you, Society. Thank you, John Semper, Tom DeFalco, Maggie Thompson, Mark Ditko, Brian Bendis. Lindsay, are you there? I think only you have the superpower to end this. Thank you, everybody, for showing up and sticking around.
Thank you, Danny.
Thanks, Dan.
Great to see everybody.
Have a great day.
Everybody
Bye-bye.
stay well. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.